So we're going to hear from our comrade Kotsai, who is speaking on behalf of the Revolutionary Communist Group, Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, and Rock Around Blockade. So, Kotsai, over to you. You have the floor.
Okay. uh, Comrades from the Revolutionary Communist Group, as you've been told, went to Cuba for the May Day Brigade in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution. There were over 300 people on this brigade from about 19 different countries, where we not only brought badly needed material aid to the Cuban people, but we also got to see what it means to fight for socialism while under constant attack from US imperialism. Next slide, please. On the brigade, our days were packed with sessions where we had exchanges with people from many sections of Cuban society, and we saw firsthand how the Cuban people live and specifically how they apply creative resistance to continue to survive and build socialism despite the blockade. And to just name a few examples, we had exchanges with students from the University of Artemisa that study agroecology and use their techniques to improve Cuban farming. We visited a school and a hospital to see the Cuban education and health system, and we gained a concrete understanding of how they work. We did voluntary labor on different farms. We had an exchange with the Cuban Trade Union Congress to learn about employment rights in Cuba and the role that trade unions play in a socialist society. We visited the Che Guevara Memorial to see a national hero, a socialist national hero, and how the Cuban people commemorate that. We also visited a scientific center called CombioMed, which is a state enterprise that innovates to create and produce and commercialize medical equipment related to cardiovascular issues. And we also attended an international conference where we heard contributions from delegations from around the world. And we listened to the Cuban president himself, Miguel Diaz-Canel, speak, where he spoke about the importance of international solidarity and internationalism and how what that means to the Cuban people. All of this was how we got to see, as socialists in Britain, we got to see what it means to fight for socialism in practice, what it means to implement theory into practice. And this was an invaluable experience for our comrades. Next slide. On the brigade, we were able to witness the determination of the Cuban people to defend their national sovereignty. And this was clearly illustrated on May Day itself. We saw over 600,000 Cuban workers from around the country, and they took to the streets in Revolution Square in Havana to march. It was a loud and vibrant celebration of the gains of their revolution. But on the other hand, it was also a march in defense of their revolution. It was a show of defiance against US imperialism, which is tightening its barbaric siege on the country by introducing a whole host of punitive measures, which I'll get to later. It is in this context that we saw that massive march of Cuban people taking to the streets to show that they'll defend their revolution and their self-determination, which they have made countless sacrifices for. May Day was also a confirmation of the internationalism of the Cuban Revolution. On the march, we saw Palestine flags, showing that the Cuban people still have solidarity with Palestine and their struggle for national liberation. We saw Venezuelan flags flown as well, another country that is struggling for socialism and self-determination and is being punished in a similar way to Cuba by US imperialism for it. Personally, I have never seen a May Day march like this, especially not in Britain, where the May Day rally in London this year had maybe only about 1,000 people. So the Cuban people, why do they have such huge and vibrant May Day rallies? It's because they are defending an active and living revolutionary process, and they recognize that their struggle for socialism and self-determination is inherently an international struggle. Next slide. During the Brigade, we attended many other sessions that demonstrated the internationalism of socialist Cuba. We visited ELAM, the Latin American School of Medicine, where we met medical students from all around the world that were given scholarships to study in Cuba for free. There were students from Africa, from Palestine, from the Caribbean, from Latin America. And what's notable here is that these are regions that have been ravaged and condemned to poverty and over exploitation by imperialism. Since its revolution, Cuba has had a firm commitment to fighting imperialism and underdevelopment around the world. And that is why, despite the hardships caused by the blockade, they still either send doctors to some of the most overexploited countries in the world, or they train people from those countries in medicine to then go back to their countries. At another point in the Brigade, we were shown a documentary by Belly of the Beast called From Gaza to Cuba that follows a Palestinian doctor from Gaza who studied at Elam. And the first chance he gets, he'll be returning to Palestine to serve his community that is currently fighting Zionist occupation. The value of Elam can't be overstated. We live in a world where billions of people are denied access to healthcare because imperialism puts profits over people. And socialist Cuba is the one nation seriously fighting against this with what little it has. Next slide. In Santa Clara, we also had an exchange with Cuban veteran combatants who had fought in Angola to defend the revolutionary government of the MPLA against apartheid South Africa and UNITA counter-revolutionaries in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. They were defending the Angolan revolution from imperialism, and their victory in Angola was one of the things that collapsed apartheid in South Africa and also led to Namibia winning back its independence against South African occupation. One of the combatants that we met not only went there to fight, but also stayed behind to teach in a village. These veterans were very politically conscious and they understood why they were in Angola, and they were proud of why they were in Angola. A different group of veterans were asked why they wanted to go and fight in Angola, and one of them replied, "It was our debt to humanity." That is the kind of consciousness that the Cuban Revolution has created in its people. While imperialist states such as Britain and the US were economically, militarily, and politically supporting white supremacy in Southern Africa, the Cuban people were fighting and giving their lives to destroy white supremacy in Southern Africa. That is what internationalism is, and that is what it means to make the struggle against imperialism a global one. Cuba today carries on this tradition proudly because it remains on the front line of the struggle against imperialism. It plays a central role in the anti-imperialist struggle alongside Venezuela, alongside Palestine, alongside the Alliance of Sahel States. This year, during celebrations marking the anniversary of the victory of the Soviet Union against fascism in Russia, we saw President Miguel Diaz-Canel with President Nicolas Maduro and President Ibrahim Traore. Like Cuba, Venezuela and Burkina Faso are under vicious attack by imperialism because these nations like Cuba have dared to stand up against imperialism and fight for their self-determination. That is what it means to be on the front line of the struggle against imperialism. That is what makes the Cuban Revolution an internationalist revolution, not simply a national one. It is a socialist revolution because it is international by its very nature. Next slide. So the Cuban Revolution, an internationalist socialist revolution, must be defended because it is under increasingly vicious attack. After Donald Trump's inauguration, we published an article in Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism called Trump 2025, a new era of US imperialism. And this new era of US imperialism is being felt not only in the US, but it is being felt throughout the world. As US imperialism continues to decline, we are seeing it become more vicious, reactionary, and violent. as it desperately tries to maintain its hegemonic position and seek out new areas for profit making and exploitation. In Palestine, we're seeing the continued genocide in Gaza and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. And in Cuba, we're seeing the tightening of the siege on the island, brutal collective punishment against the people who are fighting for their self-determination. And before I get to Trump's new measures, we need to put this in context because Cuba has been under this brutal blockade since the 1960s. The blockade is extraterritorial by its very nature, so Cuba is effectively isolated from world trade, cutting it off from important necessities. It has cost Cuba $13 million a day, and some estimates suggest Cuba could have been copped trillions from this blockade. Ships that dock in Cuba can't dock in the US for 6 months. We see parasitic US investors systematically buying up shares in companies that trade with Cuba so that they fall under blockade regulations. We saw Cuba being placed under the state sponsors of terrorism list so that bank transactions with Cuba are almost impossible. It is disgusting and ironic that Cuba is considered a state sponsor of terrorism when it is the CIA that has sponsored terror attacks and outright invasions against Cuba. On the Brigade, a Cuban student asked the brigadistas at our camp to give one example of Cuban aggression against the US, and no one could name a single thing. That is the context that Cuba has been under and been trying to build socialism under. And it's only getting worse. Trump's new measures are far reaching, and they include financial penalties for third parties trading with or financially helping Cuba, intimidation of foreign tourists who go to Cuba by threats of non-entry to the US. We're seeing threats to third-party countries that accept Cuban doctors. We're seeing penalties being placed on people who are trying to assist Cuba on humanitarian grounds. And we're seeing restrictions on family remittances from Cuban families in the US. All of this has a purpose, and the purpose has always been the same. In the words of Lester D. Mallory, former US Secretary of State, it is to weaken the economic life of Cuba, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. US imperialism won't allow a successful example of socialism to exist at its doorstep, and it can't allow a liberated nation that it cannot exploit to exist. Castro was absolutely correct when he said that what the US imperialists cannot forgive is the fact that the Cuban people made a socialist revolution right under their noses, and that is why they are being punished for it. Now Cuba is under severe economic crisis, and we saw the effects of this firsthand. There were at least one blackout every single day. There are periods throughout the day where there is simply no running water. In Havana, there are buildings that are falling apart because Cuba can't import the construction materials it needs. From Biomed, the state-run enterprise I mentioned earlier, actually has higher costs because to make bank transactions, they have to use intermediaries. This is because Cuba is designated as a state sponsor of terrorism. The school that we visited actually told us that they can't get enough textbooks for everyone. We had an exchange with the Young Communist League in Cuba, Union of Young Communists in Cuba, and they told us that many young people simply emigrate from the island due to the situation and lack of opportunities, which is why now Cuba has an aging population. Cuba could manufacture the medicines it needs. It is a world leader in healthcare and pharmaceuticals, but it can't get the inputs, which is why people have to bring material aid to Cuba in the first place because of the blockade. And we can also see how it's affected tourism, which was one of the ways that Cuba was making its income, a concession that had to be made. But this income from tourism is not as high as it used to be. And hospitals, despite being world class, simply can't get access to the newest equipment. And these are only a small sample of the things that we've seen the blockade cause. We have to be clear. The blockade is a crime against humanity, and it is shameful that it's been allowed to go on for this long. It is actually a testament to the Cuban people that they still continue to resist US imperialism despite being forced to live under these conditions. This is the reality of imperialism. A small island nation that wants nothing more than self-determination, an alternative way of living for itself and oppressed people around the world, is being punished with economic siege, military threats, and state-sponsored terrorism. This is why we say we must defend the Cuban Revolution. Now more than ever, Cuba needs our uncompromising solidarity. And we cannot simply appeal to bourgeois institutions such as the UN. Last year, every nation except the US and the Zionist entity voted to condemn the blockade at the UN last year, and nothing has changed. We need to find new creative ways to challenge the blockade from the grassroots. The One C for Cuba campaign is just one of those initiatives, but there can be many more. We currently at Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism are organizing a speaking tour to mark the 60th anniversary of the Tricontinental Conference next year. We will be having speakers representing anti-imperialist and socialist struggles around the world, including Cuba. And if you are able to, you need to get involved in that. And next slide. In all of our political work moving forward, we need to have the image of this year's May Day in our heads. Whether we're organizing in solidarity with Palestine, whether we're organizing against state racism, whether we're organizing in our workplace, the image of May Day in Cuba this year, that image is the future that we're fighting for. As I said before, over 600,000 people were out to celebrate and defend the gains of their revolution in Havana, despite the hardships, despite the poverty imposed by US imperialism, and despite the increasing attacks. The Cuban people continue to resist as they have done since the days of Spanish colonialism. That is why Cuba continues to be an inspiration to anti-imperialists all around the world, from Palestine to West Africa to Venezuela. Cuba has been paying its debt to humanity for over 66 years. We, as anti-imperialists, as socialists, as communists, we must repay our debt to Cuba with solidarity. Long live socialist Cuba, until victory always, and down with the blockade.